All right, welcome back to class. Today I'd like to talk a bit about ethnoarchaeology, that is, ethnography, for the purpose of gaining insight into how different human behaviors create archaeological sites. My formal definition of ethnoarchaeology shall be conducting ethnology for the purpose of developing theory that links specific human behaviors with the archaeological evidence that it produces. It is the combination of ethnology and archaeology. Today I thought I would share with you some of the slides that I took while I was in Africa in 1997. These slides are mostly from 1997, although I continued to work there in the summers until 2001. I was in central Kenya, in a fairly arid part of the country, just north of the equator, in between Nairobi and the border of Somalia. I was initially there to do work on my dissertation, which was a geoarchaeological study of a river basin. But it was a little surreal when I first arrived. This was supposed to be Samburu country, a tribe of nomadic pastoralists who raised livestock for the majority of their socioeconomic needs. However, when I first arrived, the area was completely devoid of people. I even encountered Samburu homesteads called manyatas that were completely empty. Even the fireplaces were warm, but not a person in sight. I later discovered that a conflict had broken out between the majority Samburu people and a minority ethnic group, the Somali. Allegedly, 13 people had been killed during a cattle raid by some Somali against a Samburu manyata. What I learned was that the local pastoralists responded by migrating away from the disaffected area, essentially as a preparation for war, because a stream of young male Samburu warriors filtered through the area looking for evidence of their Somali enemies, who were long gone by now. My travels were taking me into the heart of this area, where I would meet up with some archaeologists from Texas A&M who were conducting a survey. Their camp would be near a small, isolated Catholic school, literally alone in the middle of the desert, that gave free education to pastoralist children. Just outside the school, there was a small scattered encampment of Turkana pastoralists. Their numbers were low, just a few hundred, and they apparently felt that as uninvolved third-party observers to this conflict, that they would not have to flee. But as it were, Samburu suspicion fell upon them too, and they abandoned their camps. But instead of fleeing the area, they aggregated as one large unit just outside the Catholic school in what you might call a macro encampment. Upon my arrival, in the absence of any other ethnic encampments in the area, I made friends with a single Turkana family whom I encountered while they were out collecting wood. Turkana are East African pastoralists, much like the Samburu, but their home is much farther to the north, several hundred kilometers. So these Turkana, for whatever reason, were living down here, away from their distant relatives. But today we're here to talk about ethnoarchaeology. Pastoralists are nomads, so site abandonment was something I wanted to record. What happens when pastoralists abandon their site and move to a new one? I decided to get the before and the after picture. One morning, as I was walking over to camp, this is what I saw. This is about 9 or 10 a.m. in the morning. If I arrived just a little bit earlier, I would have seen that the hut in the center would have been covered just like the one on the left. What was happening was that these folks were in the process of quickly moving on. So we went from a situation where the camp looked completely stable, and then overnight the camp was emptying out. We have the entire encampment abandoned with only the armature frameworks of their huts left, and some stones where their cooking hearths had been. Some of the huts were just flat out gone. In ethnoarchaeology, we look for natural experiments that will help us learn about and develop theory that helps us understand and link observable behavior to the archaeological record. In this particular case, right in front of me, I was seeing the abandonment of a pastoralist camp and what sort of archaeology would be left behind when they left. So going back in time a little bit, I just have a few slides. I can show you a view that shows sort of the moving process. People gathering together all of their belongings, putting them in these baskets, looking they're luggage carriers, basketry luggage carriers, and pretty much everything that would fit in someone's house would fit in one of these luggage carriers. Now, if you take a look at the house, you'll see it's covered with boxes, some cloth, and some other scavenged materials. That's because the camp was already something of a refugee camp. They had moved here from nearby prior to the conflict. If they had lived here for a long time, this would be either covered with leather cowhide or a mud stucco called mandazi, making a solid dome-shaped structure. There's usually a hole in the ceiling where smoke can get out. They're not terribly large. When they're 8 foot in diameter, they're comfortable for 1 or 2 people, but you can tell by the construction of this particular house and the one to the left that these were temporary housings. The group had all moved here at the same time when the warfare started. Then they sort of coalesced around the school. They were essentially looking after each other in these uncertain times, so they banded together. Here it was unclear to me if things had gotten worse or if things had gotten better. Were they moving back to where they had lived before, or were they moving on to another location? You may have seen a group of men in the back as they were discussing what was going to happen. The structures that you saw back there are some of the outbuildings that are affiliated with the school I was talking about. Back in camp, you'll see mostly it's women doing the loading and unloading, as women are in charge of the entire domestic sphere. Here, Chamali is helping his wife load up the donkeys, but usually women are pretty much in charge of building, maintaining, packing, and unpacking. Anything to do with the household is their domain. Another shot of loading up the family belongings, and a shot of loading the donkey with pretty much everything they own and getting ready to move out. I'm going to skip through some slides here because they're somewhat repetitive, and I want to get to the archaeology at the end, so just a few comments. Here in the foreground, someone decided to take the actual armature framework of the house with them, so they cut the house in half and laid it down. You can see it really doesn't look like much. The next slide shows a young woman carrying that house on her head to its new location. I suspect she decided that it would be easier to just transport the house that she had built rather than it would to build a new one, so she takes the armature with her. Presumably, she'll place that down wherever she's going to end up. In her right hand, she's got a machete. Later, I'll show you how machetes are used to help build the house at its new location. These girls were headed also to their new location. They have a little puppy, which, if you can make out, is right there underneath the lockbox here. Poor little guy fell out right after I took this picture and got stepped on by the donkey. In any case, I think he was okay. So back to the empty camp. In the typical abandonment process in archaeology, people take everything of value with them. Everything of value they packed up, and what they've left behind is mostly the stuff that nobody wants. With the exception of the armature frameworks, which do represent a bunch of labor, and who knows, women may or may not come back and salvage some of these materials. But even if they didn't salvage them, it wouldn't be long before time and weather destroyed these items. You see a little piece of sheet metal over there that had been scavenged, but you really don't see much in the way of personal effects. And this is typical in archaeology of the sorts of things that we have at our disposal. In this slide here, you have little bits of trash along the edges. You have the armature framework, and then you have this small fireplace. So if we were to find this archaeologically, if this were to somehow become buried, we would see relatively rockless sediments with a group of cobbles or small boulders put into a semicircular ring in the center, and then you would see post holes around the outside. You see holes where these pieces of wood are sticking now. In a later slide, I'll show you a little bit more detail about how houses are constructed. But what happens is they dig a series of holes that represent the diameter of the house, and they put clusters of sticks into each of these holes. Before I get into before I get to that, I have a couple of slides here just because a lot of folks like to understand a little bit more about pastoralism and what it means. These particular Turkana own goats and camels and would be considered poor by Samburu standards. Samburu, when they live here in larger numbers, their predominant livestock would be cattle, and they represent wealth in terms of how much cattle you own, and owning goats and camels, it's considered much lower status. So one of the things that's important about pastoralism is that it is a great adaptation for this environment. If you think of this environment, it's not terribly productive agriculturally. It rains very little and the soil isn't very rich. You really couldn't grow much here. You could try to hunt here, but there really are too many people to live off the landscape. There's dozens of people per square mile living here just with the Turkana, and when the Samburu come back, you can imagine a population density of potentially 300-400 people per square mile, especially in the immediate area. And there just isn't enough food available to live exclusively off hunting and gathering. So you have a method of living, pastoralism, where you take animals that can eat the sorts of things that are growing on the desert savanna, whether it's be grass or leaves or even sticks. Goats can eat almost anything. They take this otherwise humanly inedible environment and they convert it into something that humans can live off of, namely meat products and milk. Milk, they can take they can harvest milk sustainably. Meat requires sacrificing animals, so on purely long-term survivalist grounds, and they prefer not to kill their animals if it's not avoidable. So they manage their herd for maximum herd size. So for additional proteins, they often harvest blood rather than meat. The man in the center of this image, his name is Chamali. We saw him earlier, and he really was eager to show me how this is done. Now he's preparing to shoot the camel in the neck with an arrow. You might see that the arrow has a little tether on it because he doesn't want to kill the animal. He just really wants to nick it. So he takes this arrow and he shoots it, and the tether prevents it from going into the camel's neck. Rather, it nicks it and just creates a stream of blood. In this slide, if you look really carefully, you can actually see the blood just starting to come out. They gather the blood into this bucket and they take the blood and stir it up. They're experts at this procedure and know how much blood they can take out of the camel without permanently harming it. They don't want the camel to die because camels produce a consistent supply of milk. This is where they stir the blood up, and they're essentially taking out fibrin. Fibrin is a blood clotting agent that occurs naturally in the blood, and by taking it out, the blood will last longer and stay liquid longer. They can either discard the fibrin that coagulates on this stick, or they can eat it directly. You can see my Aquafina bottle in the back right. I brought that with me, and there's actually a funny story about me giving those bottles to them. If you ask me about it in class, maybe I'll tell you the story about me and the Aquafina bottles. I've got some other slides here from a different lecture, this one on body modification. And you can see the scarification on this young man's chest, for example. This one about getting water in the desert. You see there was actually a rainstorm. This is what it looks like after a rainstorm. It came through here, and you can actually see there's a little bit of surface water here and there. But they don't collect water from the surface. They dig for it. And in this case, the water is very shallow. I've seen times when you can have women down in a pit that's 2 or 3 times their height trying to get water out. But in this particular instance, what they do is she's going to dig a hole there, and the water is muddy. But after she's done digging it, and she scoops out all the muddy water, and then lets the water filter back in slowly, and as it does so, it's much cleaner, and she's able to collect clear water in that fashion. I could tell you from some of these other pictures a little bit about ethnic groups, but I'll skip that for now. Here's a picture of the family that I made friends with and was closest to. A couple of things you'll notice, that this is all one fairly closely related family. The man in the reddish cloth in the middle, his name is Essakon, and he was the head of household. The other adult males are his sons and one brother-in-law peeking his head in from the back. The 2 women to his right are his second and third wives. You'll see that his second wife there is wearing a crucifix. She's ostensibly Catholic. Again, that's probably a lecture for another time. Nimoy, the girl on the far right, she also wears a crucifix. You can see in this picture something. First of all, those adults are taller than me. They're strong and relatively healthy. Of course, I have no idea what their internal parasite condition is, but you can see just by looking at that they're well built and their teeth are quite healthy. And there's a lot of stereotype misinformation about health status of people in Africa. These folks are pursuing a pastoralist diet of milk, blood, and meat, supplemented with occasional beans, rice, or cornmeal that they get from the church. Probably the least healthy thing they eat is the cornmeal, but they don't eat much of it. With a good diet of milk and blood, they grow up with plenty of proteins and vitamins. They're strong and healthy, and they have healthy teeth. Toothbrushing is common with all natural materials, usually a frayed green stick from the acacia tree, which they'll chew on. Here's a picture of Nasure shown with her crucifix in the front of her beaded necklace and a very distinctive Turkana look. She's got leaf-shaped earrings going up each ear, and her scalp is shaved except for a thin strip down the center. It's a very Turkana style. It's really indicative of her ethnicity. Over here you have a picture of Essakon and Nasure in their Sunday best attire standing next to a young Dr. Pearl. I'm the one on the left, in case you're wondering. Actually, I'm a good scale, I suppose, to show you that these folks are taller than me and have a diet to support that growth. Well, enough said about that. I took pictures of some of the animals for another lecture. I collected a lot of songs while I was there. I worked with a gentleman to my right. His name is Lawrence Epeyot. And he was my key informant and interpreter as I was working in this area. He helped me collect a lot of data, and he was actually learning a lot about his own culture as well, because he didn't grow up living with the Turkana. I'm going to skip a few slides that will show you some other aspects. The woman collecting firewood, wet season in the river. Lawrence wanted to get a picture collecting blood. A couple of girls. Lady doing some cooking. Family. Wish I could return that picture to them. But now we reach what I'm looking for. I would like to get to the house construction section here. Here you can see the process of beginning house construction. See a couple of holes have been excavated in the foreground and also at right. These holes are excavated first with a machete. Then she's got there a digging stick and she's tamping in the dirt around some of the sticks that she's put there. These sticks are not long enough to go completely over in an arch, but they're long enough to make a curve that ends up at the top. I think the next slide will show you about how long some of these sticks are. You'll see they cluster them, though, in these holes that they've excavated. Notice how little kids are usually just, if they can't walk, they're just slung on the back, and women will continue to work with kids on their back very routinely. So here you get an idea of how long some of those sticks are and about how thick they are. They may be 3/4 of an inch thick to 1 inch thick at the base, and maybe 6 to 8 feet tall. They put these sticks into a hole and then they join them at the top. It takes a number of people to do this effectively, although you probably could do it by yourself. It's a lot easier when you have people to help you. So this is an example sort of the community coming together and helping this lady with a couple of kids build her house. This slide is showing you the house being lashed together. This lady here is bringing in let me go back one slide. 2 slides. This lady here in this slide is bringing in some softer material. This is some kind of tree bark, strips of tree bark. It's green, and it can be used to tie together these supports. And when it dries, it shrinks and becomes a very effective wrap. You get an idea here that a house is about tall enough to almost stand up in. House is actually a little bit small. I think they probably made this a little too quickly because they knew I was there watching. I'm pretty sure they took this house down fairly soon after they built it and remade it a little wider. Now at this point, they're starting to put on the coverings. I mentioned that these folks were refugees. If you work up in northern Turkana, you'd see these houses are all covered either by cowhide or by mud. This mud, which is in Swahili is called mandazi, is a mixture of dirt, ash, and cow dung. It holds together really well, and it's a great insulator. Most houses in the Samburu district are covered in that mandazi. It makes a nice little rounded semi-permanent dome. It's reminiscent of an igloo. Provides a lot of protection from heat, cold, and rain as well. Even though they're made out of mud, they're relatively water resistant, certainly through a couple of storms, and you can always patch them up with additional mud coats on the outside and the inside. This one, though, is covered with burlap and plastic bags, paper, boxes, whatever they can find. Supplies here were harder to come by at this particular time because of their refugee status, and they only planned on living here for a short while. The truth is, we're seeing the birth of a settlement. If you look at satellite photos today, you can see that an entire small town has grown up around here, and it was settled. And there's probably a paper for me to write in there somewhere, because this was the birth of a town. Here's the final results you have for this lady. So this house is intended for her and her 2 children. She does not have a husband. According to Lawrence, she was divorced. Of course, he said this after having told me just a week earlier that they didn't have such a thing as divorce in their culture. So I'm not sure what to think about that. I suppose that's another story, but since we're doing an archaeology class, I just want to point out to you that all of this effort is something that we can't see in the archaeological record. It's archaeologically invisible. When we're excavating, what we will find are post holes. We will find, if we're exceptionally fortunate, we'll find the bottoms of the posts that were in there. But more likely, the materials that they're using here are so ephemeral that they probably dissolve away and not withstand the test of time. If you're really fortunate, you may find the central fire ring intact, or at least find ash in the center or a darkening of the soil where they're living, depending on how long they live there. Something I didn't cover in this video, but I cover in a paper that I'm working on, shows you how all these houses are related to one another in space. So you have families that live near each other, and they form themselves into a ring, a rather large ring. In the center of that ring, you have a large corral where the community keeps their animals. So all these things I was recording in an effort to better understand what the archaeological record might look like if we were to excavate maybe a single house. You know what the relationship between the size of a house is and who's in it, what's the relationship of the location of the house to the other houses, what's the social status of the individuals who live next door to one another, etc. These are all things that I recorded with a combination of a census, watching them build houses, making maps of the houses they built, and so forth. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this little brief introduction to ethnoarchaeology. Watch it, take notes, and then take a quiz, which I haven't quite put up yet, but we'll get to shortly. Thank you.